In a city of glass and salt air, where towers rise like mirages out of the Gulf and fortunes move faster than the tides, a night of celebration turned into a riddle written in blood. The most lavish wedding of 2024 in the coastal metropolis of Zafir, where chandeliers drip with light and secrets shine as bright as diamonds, ran exactly 14 hours. The marriage itself? 47 minutes. Before sunrise, the bride lay motionless. The groom was gone, and a $500,000 spectacle had crystallized into the strangest crime scene the city had ever seen. Police called it rage. The truth was a blueprint, etched and rehearsed for 2 years, springing shut on every person who set it in motion. No one was out of place. No one was innocent. And no one saw it coming. You're listening to a story from under the polished floors of Zafir's elite. I'm your narrator, guiding you through a labyrinth of pride, power, and private crusades. If this is your first time here, settle in. Because what follows will make you question the line between faith and control, tradition and theater, love and a weapon dressed in white. Meet the man who never needed to raise his voice to win a room, Nadir al-Haddad. 31. A developer whose towers carry his family name across the skyline, a son of old merchants who traded spices when the coastline was quiet and the world didn't yet turn on screens. In public, Nadir was careful and kind. He kissed the hands of elders. He funded Quran competitions and sat, demure and obliging, beside his mother at charity galas. He was the model son to a dynasty that worshipped order. But behind a carved wooden door at the back of his library, past the first edition poetry, past the prayer rug carefully folded and perfumed, he kept the kind of notebooks that made ink feel like poison. Not ledgers of land deals or project timelines. Not names of ministers or movers. Folder after folder labeled with a single word, audits. Nadir's private obsession was not profit. It was proof. Proof that women he deemed modern were liars. Proof that his instincts were righteous. Proof that purity could be measured, inventoried, and if necessary, broken. For 3 years, he ran what he told himself were moral assessments. He picked targets who rattled his sense of order. Educated, articulate women who traveled, led teams, spoke their minds in rooms where men like Nadir were used to speaking last. He watched. He cataloged. He created profiles. And when the pile of insinuations became a mountain, he staged revelations. He did not strike with hands. He stood back ashamed at his work. One lost a position she loved. One vanished overseas after a brother threw her phone into the sea and hissed a sentence that does not need repeating. One tried to stop her own breathing and was dragged back by a neighbor who heard too much silence. It wasn't enough. Not for Nadir. The workman had become a preacher in his own skull. Expose them, a voice said. Cleanse the city. But something inside him shifted, hardened, demanded ceremony. His next campaign would be sanctified. He would not simply unmask a woman. He would marry her first. He would make her his and then make her nothing. In the island of the mind where monsters negotiate with saints, Nadir convinced himself this was piety. A test, a service. The woman he chose was not a stranger. He had registered her months earlier, across a ballroom thick with gold and glass. She was laughing, but not loudly. Modestly dressed, but not meek. Everything about her suggested balance. Light in the eyes, calm in the hands, a way of making other people feel seen. Her name was Mira Al-Sayeg, 26, international business graduate. Fluent in 4 languages. A diplomat's daughter who'd learned early that grace is a currency. Mira had loved once. London nights and books and a boy named Eli who read her poetry aloud. They had planned a shared future until someone else's future called him home. No scandal. No headlines. Love ends quietly more often than it explodes. After he left, she buried the photographs in a folder called Summer and sealed the past as best she could. For exactly half a year before the wedding that would put her name in every headline, Mira's phone betrayed her. A message here, a comment there. Not threats, not at first, suggestions. Remember the garden on Gibbon Street? That bar near the museum? Then screenshots of private exchanges. Grainy photos taken from the wrong angles. She panicked. Then she reasoned. Perhaps Eli wanted a door open. Perhaps a jealous classmate bored. But the pattern thickened. The tone sharpened. Whoever they were studying her, mapping her, adjusting to her every pivot. It felt like being watched through keyholes no one else could see. When the Al-Haddads approached the Al-Sayegs with a proposal, Mira's stomach went cold. Wealth on one side, influence on the other. Everyone in Zafir pretended such matches were about values. Everyone in Zafir knew what they were really about. Yet the problem wasn't the timeless dance of class and advantage. It was the presence of a signature she knew too well. The private messages. The surveillance. She had followed the breadcrumbs the way she'd been taught to follow market trends, slowly, methodically, with a notebook out of sight. She traced burner accounts to disposable numbers to a cheap laptop to a private investigator who was unremarkable until he wasn't. And then to Nadir himself. Yes, he was her suitor. Yes, he was also her shadow. Mira is often misread by those who meet her only unprepared. There is softness in her voice that people mistake for passivity. Few know how quietly stubborn she can be. What would you do, listening now, if the man asking for your hand had spent months trying to fracture your life? Run? Scream? Mira did neither. She considered the assumptions of the man who thought she would shrink, and she built a case. She warned no one. She confided in no one. She accepted Nadir's proposal with a smile that never reached her eyes. She was going to walk into the trap with a map. Here's the part that people like to pretend is incidental but never is. Both families were sinking, though they held themselves like ships of state. The Al-Sayyigs, embassy people with photos of presidents on their stairway, were neck-deep in informal loans and formal obligations. A construction grant had disappeared into a cousin's pockets. An audit date had been circled on the father's calendar. The mother's illness had become narrative cover for gaps that couldn't be explained without handcuffs. The Al-Haddads had larger problems. Their high-rises were legal. Their land was less so. Too many signatures carried an extra pen stroke. Too many parcels had changed hands in rooms without windows. What they needed desperately was the shelter of a respectable alliance. It wasn't love. It was camouflage. Nadir presented Mira like a prize he'd hunted, and the elders applauded. The Al-Sayyigs thanked fate for what looked like a parachute. Both households turned away when the children's eyes kept asking questions they dared not vocalize. It is easier to prop up a legend than dismantle a lie when everyone's savings and reputations are tied to the lie's scaffolding. Courtships in Zafir can be public theater. The couple appears in photos like two halves of a medallion. Families negotiate venues, menus, dowries with the care of diplomats. All the while, a private war hums beneath the crystal and silk. Nadir sharpened his knives. He paid a man named Khalaf Kabisi, a fixer who called himself a consultant, to continue building dossiers that made ordinary experiences look like convictions. He ordered images printed and collated, step-by-step proofs of what he'd chosen to call unworthiness, Mira recorded. She bought a tiny device and stitched it into an underskirt. She uploaded copies of every conversation to an offshore drive. She found 3 women who flinched when she introduced herself and then relaxed when she ignored their flinch. Rana, who had taught history until whispers turned her into a cautionary tale. Sahar, who built a tech firm from nothing and watched investments evaporate when rumors smoked out of nowhere. Noor, a young reporter whose pen ran dry after a campaign of messages and fake accounts, drove her to the airport with a suitcase and a headscarf pulled low. Together, the 4 women became quiet partners in an operation that had only one aim: exposure. They didn't want money. They wanted daylight. A date was set. The wedding would be held at the Celestia Palace, an ivory hotel set on a man-made crescent, with a ballroom that mirrored the sea and a suite at the top that was larger than most homes. 512 guests. A troupe of drummers flown in from the interior. The city's most influential imam to bless the union. A cake that needed 3 men to carry each tier. The guest list read like a snapshot of the city's power structure. Ministers, moguls, media. A musician who sang at palace weddings. The children of men who moved oil, moved laws, moved borders. From the outside, it was perfect. Choreography so precise you could ask, even years later, whether the songs were the same beat per minute. From the inside, it was siege warfare. The Al-Haddads counted favors. The Al-Sayyigs cross-checked which photographs would land in which papers. Nader rehearsed lines he'd written for a private performance. Mira rehearsed how to breathe evenly when his private performance began. Every laugh she gave, every blush, was part of a plan to look exactly like what he expected. She lowered her eyes when elders addressed her. She walked with calm bearings through rooms where everyone tested silk. She touched her mother's hand and kept herself from telling the truth. She nodded to aunties and smiled at cousins and carried a secret recording device against her hip like a second heartbeat. Speeches were given. Honor was invoked. The couple signed the contract, touched a pen, whispered the words that sealed them in the eyes of community and law. Nadir kissed his father's hand. Mira embraced her sister. Each did exactly what was expected while plotting, something none of those 512 guests would have imagined if you'd read them the transcript beforehand. Midnight approached, and with it, the ritual the city pretends is pure romance, but which, in this case, was the last act of a play. The door to the sky suite closed. Marble. Roses. The hush of air thick with perfume. The ceiling could reflect your face back at you even if you didn't want to see it. Nader went to his case and removed a folder. Not thin, not subtle. He placed the stack on the glass table with the confidence of someone who has never been told no by a consequence that stuck. I know everything, he said, voice flat. The man in London. The messages you thought were private. The places you went and the times you lied. I know. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He opened the folder and cut the ribbon he'd used to bind the pages. Photographs laid out like exhibits. Prints of chats pulled from places a decent man does not reach for. Receipts stamped by the same hands that stamped stolen deeds. He had turned living into evidence. He had turned her past into a sermon. Mira met his eyes and did something he had not scripted. She smiled. Not mockery, not glee. A sad curve that said she had already walked through this room in her mind and knew the exits. I know, she answered softly. She reached into the lining of her dress and pulled out her phone, the recorder still running, glowing with a waveform that reacted to their breath. Then she drew from the bag she'd brought a thick envelope of her own. I know about Rana. I know about Sahar. I know about Noor. I know about Khalaf. I know about the accounts you used to pay men to follow me. I know this was never about me. It was about anyone like me. I know everything. The hunter felt the floor move. For a second, he looked like a boy staring at a mirror that told the truth about the person watching him. He reached forward instinctively, as if he might take the sound back into her device by sheer force of will. You don't understand, he said. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps no one understands fully when a myth is breached while wearing a tuxedo. You're a liar. You are not what you showed my mother. You are not. Her voice was steady. What you think purity is has very little to do with God, she said. It has everything to do with fear. You fear women who cannot be controlled by your stories. You fear looking at yourself without the filter of tradition you distort to excuse what you are. The argument that followed was not a debate. It was an avalanche of 2 years of calculation breaking loose simultaneously. Nadir raged the way a prophet in his own mind rages when the congregation laughs at him. Mira spoke with the certainty of someone who knows that whatever happens next, she will not be a symbol carved by someone else's knife. Words cracked against the glass. Voices rose and then fell and then rose again. And in the space where ideology collides with escalating panic, the fight left the tongue. We do not need to describe what came next in detail to understand it. Nader grabbed what was closest. Mira pushed back. He reached for her again. She struck him when he moved toward the devices on the table. He squeezed her arm too hard, then her throat. She clawed at his sleeve. A glass fell. Something shattered. The room is not a witness unless it is recording, and this room was. 2 phones, 2 perspectives, picking up sound and breath and struggle. It ended quickly. Fury is efficient. Grief is not. When the quiet returned, it sat like a third person. Files lay sprawled across marble. One phone had fallen beneath the low couch's edge, capturing nothing but carpet and air conditioning, and a sound every investigator would later replay in their own kitchens and hear when they tried to sleep. In another corner, her other recorder blinked red, then dark. The door did not open again until morning's light reached up the tower. Security knocked. No answer. A key card. The scene. The notes. The devices. The woman on the floor. The man gone. The initial judgment was predictable. Domestic tragedy spawned by shame. But Zafir's detectives are not fools, and their city is small enough that every crime is also a message to someone. They followed the thread. The audio they retrieved was hours long. It began with laughter on the ballroom floor and ended with silence that no one wanted to hear to its finish. In between, it laid bare a campaign that turned intangible intimidation into something you could touch and file and date. It wasn't passion. It was policy. The lead investigator, a patient man named Laith Rahman, whose friends joke that he can hear a liar slow their heart through a wall, widened the circle. The name of a private consultant surfaced. Khalaf, the fixer, head down at a cafe, asked to come quietly, and did. In a windowless room with water and a box of tissues he would not touch. He spoke about clients who wanted certainty and standards and cultural preservation. Detective Rahman listened until the euphemisms ran out. Then the story spilled. Payments made to doormen, tips to waiters, small amounts that add up to a siege. Accounts that hired friends to ask leading questions in the right rooms. Threads pulled and then woven back as nets. Khalaf did not call it a cult, but if you've ever read the minutes of men who flatter each other into monsters, you know one when you hear it. There was a circle, an informal cadre of men who shared articles about the erosion of values and each other's strategies for verification. Nadir was their most disciplined member. He spoke of cleansing, of shining light, of preventing other men's shame by inflicting just enough shame early to deter. He kept logs not only on his targets, but on the methods he refined through practice. He had turned harassment into a craft. While the police lined up facts, the city lined up opinions. Gossip is Zafir's fastest train. Stories of the Sky Suite leak turned to posts, turned to headlines, turned to speeches on the floor of council. The Al-Haddads hired lawyers who blinked slowly and asked for patience. The Al-Sayyigs filed a statement asking for privacy. Neither family's plea held under the weight of what else the investigation uncovered. Someone once said that crimes are doors. Pull on one and you find the hallway behind it. That hallway stretched far. Nadir's father had diverted funds from civic projects that bore his name. Leases on municipal land were signed with letters that did not belong on those pages. Titles were smudged. The Al-Sayyig books were worse. Money had moved across borders in patterns that only lawyers and ghosts understand. Bribes that were almost gifts. Gifts that were almost bribes. A network of favors and interest that kept everyone smiling and the future mortgaged. It was almost a relief when the subject returned to the human heart. 3 women came to the precinct or sent messages from abroad or called a friend who called. Rana, small of frame but bigger every time she said the word before, described how a rumor became a rope that tightened around her career. How her headmistress asked gentle questions, then less gentle ones, then told her to take leave until the storm passed, which it never did. Sahar, whose eyes still flicked to a corner of any room for exits, spoke about board members who decided to step back after comments about compatibility with values started moving through group chats. Noor plugged her laptop into a cafe socket 3 time zones away and told of fake accounts that amplified a narrative she didn't recognize, of calling her mother and hearing silence on the other end of the line that felt like exile already. Each story fit the pattern. Private messages. Questions planted. Photographs with captions that changed their meaning. No one screamed at them. That was the point. The harm was civilized, cultured, delivered with a bow. Laith tracked Nadir into the desert by subtraction. The Al-Haddad compound on the outskirts was half-manned. A car was missing. Satellite images showed a track like a line drawn by a drunk hand across a sea of dunes. They found him 3 days later, not far from an old well he likely could not see, eyes scorched, lips split, talking to a son that did not answer. He alternated between long strings of phrases about purity and random names. When they brought him shade and water, he spoke calmly, almost academically, about his purpose. He spoke about lies women tell, about roles, about deception as a disease that required a surgeon. He did not speak of Mira as a person. He called her the case. Back in the city, under a fan, in a chair, with counsel beside him and a camera fixed to the wall, he gave a statement. He was not sorry. He was aggrieved. It was as if the heat had boiled away the social filters that let a man like him blend. He had written a document, it turned out. 100 pages. From the cover page, you could tell he had loved the time it took. It was called The Ledger of Light. If you think you've heard worse titles, you've forgotten your history. It argued that modernity had introduced chaos into relationships. It claimed that a man's duty was to verify that intrusion had not altered chastity. It used moral vocabulary to describe anxiety and control and fear. Mostly fear. The trial began half a year after the night that ended a life and detonated a city's self-image. Every bench was filled. International press sat next to neighbors who just wanted to see how expensive perfume smelled. Mira's sister, Raya, smaller and fiercer than grief wanted her to be, held their mother's hand. The Al-Haddad matriarch wore black and clutched a handkerchief, as if wringing it could undo something the law was about to make indelible. The prosecution did not need to grandstand. They pressed play. The court listened to the wedding night unfold in surround sound. They heard Nadir's voice list facts as if reciting scripture. They heard Mira's voice catalog names he would rather have kept buried. They listened until some jurors stopped pretending their pens needed adjusting and simply wiped their faces openly. Then came the evidence from the months and years before. Spreadsheets of payments to consultants. Photos taken from angles a gentleman would not permit himself. Messages sent from accounts created in the quiet hours between midnight and the call to dawn prayer. The testimony the city will remember was not technical. It was personal. Rana spoke as if she were inside a storm she'd escaped, but still smelled on her clothes. "He didn't have to touch me," she said. "He knew how we work here. He knew what happens when someone starts whispering in the right rooms." Sahar brought a folder not unlike Nadir's, but filled with investment withdrawals and board minutes, and 2 lines circled in red where someone had written, "Brand Risk." Noor, face on a screen a continent away, described learning new streets and needing new names because the old ones hurt too much. None of them wanted revenge. Each wanted the record corrected. Each wanted the city that told them they were cherished to admit that it had let them burn because someone pointed and said fire. The defense cases in such trials are part performance, part lament. Nader's lawyers argued that he was the product of social churn. They argued that the speed of change had unmoored him. They argued that his expectations and reality collided, producing a fracture. A psychiatrist for the defense used phrases like rigid moral schema. Another described delusions of mission. They painted a man overrun by the age. And then, in a move that will be studied in law schools as an example of how not to sway a jury already disgusted, they proposed a share of responsibility for the deceased. They floated the idea that she had provoked, that her courage to confront rather than confess was somehow a hand on the lever. The courtroom changed temperature. The judge allowed the argument to hang in the air long enough for everyone to smell its rot. Then the judge, a woman named Salma Badr, whose kindness is often mistaken for softness by men who underestimate it, spoke. The verdict was guilty across the counts: murder with intent, systematic stalking, conspiracy to harass. The sentence: life without parole. The remarks moved beyond the man to the city. "When tradition becomes a stick to beat people with rather than a lamp to light our way," she said, "we are lost. When honor is a pretext for humiliation, we betray both our faith and our future. What happened here did not spring from nowhere. It was permitted by those who benefit from silence. That silence has ended." The fallout was not theatrical. It was bureaucratic, slow, grinding, which is how real change hides before it shows. The Al-Haddad Empire unraveled as accountants turned over stones where contracts were too neat. The Al-Sayeghs lost invitations faster than they lost their illusions. Mira's father was charged with corruption. Her mother stopped leaving the house for a long time, then one day did and did not come back in tears. Nader's mother entered treatment for an addiction everyone had denied with cologne and pearls. Neighbors who had attended the wedding started saying they had always suspected something. People always say that when it feels safe to remove a mask. Raya did not want to become a symbol any more than her sister had wanted to become a story, but grief needs a purpose larger than memory to survive without turning venomous. She started a project named after Mira's favorite poem, a line about lanterns you keep lit for others even after your own night falls. The Lantern Project didn't have an office at first. It had a phone number and a lawyer who agreed to help and a list of therapists who knew how to patch a heart without treating it as an inconvenience. Later, it would have a center. Later, it would have a budget. It began with a promise. You are not alone. Tell us. We will hold the line with you. The city, for its part, tried to codify its shame into protections. Laws were written with teeth for people who organize harassment and for the platforms that look at hate campaigns and say, not our problem. Licensing regulations for private investigators were rewritten so that reputation management couldn't be a front for paid terror. Marriages arranged across families in the upper echelons began to require counseling sessions conducted by professionals instead of distant cousins playing therapist. Hotels added safety protocols for wedding nights, quiet mechanisms that allow a bride to call a friend, not just a concierge if she feels unsafe. Schools taught signs of coercion in the same week they taught calculus. We like to say that sunlight disinfects. It does sometimes. Other times it reveals how deep the rot goes, and then you need carpenters and courage. Zafir discovered both. Not everyone agreed. At the edges, corners gathered to complain about erosion and Western ideas and disobedience. Those corners are part of every city. But in the center, in the courts and counseling rooms, in the offices of editors who decided not to publish the kind of stories that snicker while pretending to report, things moved forward. And the men in the little circle who had felt very brave behind their screens, dissolved into their own lives, suddenly afraid that perhaps their group chats were not as private as they had believed. Their wives asked them questions they had never expected, which is a form of justice no courtroom can deliver. We return then to the beginning, to a night of dancers and perfumes and photographs that still float through the feeds of the very people who have now taken them down. Everyone loves a spectacle. No one wants to admit when the stage is a trap. Nadir built that trap not to catch Mira specifically, not at first, but to snare the world into confirming his accusations. Mira entered it to break it apart from the inside. Both were brilliant. Only one was righteous. If you're asking, did she have to marry him? Understand this. Every weapon he had was forged in silence and isolation. She understood that evidence is for courts, not whispers. That a man like Nadir would only be disarmed by proof that made even his own allies quiet. She knew that if she walked away, he would find someone else to carry his ideology next. They are not fairy tale choices, the ones real people face. They are ugly and expensive and require courage that feels like sand in your mouth when you try to swallow it. There are details people still argue about. Before the wedding, did Mira consider releasing the evidence early? Yes. She rejected it. Not enough traction. Not enough attention. Not enough context. After the engagement, did she try to warn her parents? She did, and they flinched, then fussed, then asked for proof they didn't want to hold. Did Nadir hesitate? He did not. Not once. He had rehearsed too long to let doubt spoil his performance. The Celestia Palace replaced the suite's carpets by sunset the day of the crime. Hotels are like that. They detox rooms as fast as they can. But some places keep a temperature after an event, as if air molecules remember. Staff still joke about a cold spot near the glass table, and then they stop and say they shouldn't joke about such things. The room has a new name now. Corporate branding. None of that matters. What matters is that in a city that adores control, a script went off page and forced a conversation that could not be staged. I'd like to tell you that everyone listened. They didn't. Some closed their devices and said, enough. Some said, our mothers were fine. Why are you different? And the women who had always carried double burdens, the burden of living and the burden of proving they were living correctly, rolled their eyes at each other and went back to work. Progress is not a parade. It's 1,000 small changes in 1,000 offices and kitchens. A human resources policy revised. A cousin defending a cousin instead of laughing. A man who puts his phone down and ends a chat. A mother who says, I believe you, and means it. As for Nadir, prison turned him into a cautionary tale that every father used in a different way. Some said, don't be like him because the law will catch you. Others said, don't be like him because he forgot he was human. In a corner of the penitentiary library, he wrote letters to the editor that a certain kind of magazine would be thrilled to publish if it were in another country, and people liked to read such things. The letters of light. The wardens never mailed them. They filed them in a drawer marked denied. Raya's Lantern Project grew. They offered digital literacy workshops that taught women how to secure accounts against fake friend infiltration. They trained doormen and drivers and hotel staff on recognizing stalking patterns. They funded therapy for Rana. They helped Sahar rebuild a company under a new name with new investors who were embarrassed by their predecessors. They connected Noor to a foreign editor who liked her writing so much he called her Columns Sunday Prayers. Sometimes Raya went to schools and sat on the floor with girls who wanted to ask questions their teachers didn't want them to ask. She did not scold. She told Mira's story without the marble and the roses. She told it with the numbers and the decisions and the cost. And because she never cried in front of them, the girls let themselves cry and then laugh, and then ask for internships. When we tell stories like this on shows like ours, we risk turning real lives into a season with an intro, a twist, a moral, a sponsor. That's not what I want to do. I want you to leave with two things in your hands. The first is simple, a name. Mira. Say it when people talk about purity as if it's something you can quantify like salt. Think about a woman who understood that exposure without courage is just gossip. The second is more complicated. The enemy here was not tradition. The enemy was the misuse of tradition to justify control. Faith, when honest, protects dignity. Culture, when kind, shields the vulnerable. It is fear and pride that twist those things into cages. Fear looks the same at sunset. The towers catch fire that is only light. The sea hisses against the engineered shore. Men shake hands. Women text in groups with names only they understand. But if you peer closely, you will see a city that has learned to ask, quietly and then out loud, whether whiteness at a wedding is always innocence, and whether honor can survive being used as a club. You will hear new words in old rooms. You will see doors propped open by people who used to bolt them. In another year, another story will seize this town and test its attention. That is the nature of cities and shows. But there will still be the Lantern Project's number pinned to corkboards at the back of cafes where students argue. There will still be a warden filing letters of light into a drawer. There will still be a judge whose speech will be quoted by law students who haven't even heard of the Celestia Suite. There will be mothers who say to their sons, not only respect women, but respect truth. And there will be fathers who ask their daughters not only to be careful, but to be loud. People ask me, what was the single moment where this story turned? The night in the suite? The first fake account? The alumni event where Nadir saw Mira across a ballroom and decided curiosity should be a verb you commit? I think it was earlier in both of them. In Nadir's decision to mistake fear for morality. In Mira's decision not to let fear practice on her. In a city's decision, finally, not to look away. If you came here for a twist, perhaps that's it. The twist is not that the groom was a villain. The twist is that he was not the only author of this tragedy. The men who nodded at his words were co-authors. The families who used their children as currency were editors. The platforms and investigators and silent bystanders were printers and distributors. And the readers, yes, us, were consumers until we decided we wanted a different genre. Will Zafir go back to its old stories? Cities always do, in some places, in some rooms. But enough people now carry this narrative under their tongues for it to be a counterspell. The mirror has cracked, and when you crack a mirror, you see a truer reflection because it multiplies angles. Watch for that light. Listen for it. It sounds like a judge clearing her throat and a sister dialing a phone and a woman telling another woman, it's not your fault. They used your shame to hide theirs. It sounds like a city choosing people over image and walking away from the beautiful lie. We will follow the threads. We always do. Until then, keep your lanterns lit.